This week's Geary seminar, and we have a very special guest here today, Professor David Putwain, all the way from Liverpool. Now, I'm going to do my very best to introduce Dave to you, although I have to admit to being slightly underprepared. So if there's any relationship between my introduction and what's on the flyer, that's fine. So just to say that Professor Putwain is based in the School of Education at Liverpool John Moores University and has been a teacher for some time. After completing his PhD, Dave joined Edge Hill University, working in the Department of Social and Psychological Sciences, where he established an undergraduate program in educational psychology and subsequently in the Faculty of Education. David joined Liverpool John Moores University, and his research interests focus on how psychological factors influence learning and achievement, with a particular focus on student motivation, emotion, engagement, and the classroom environment. And Dave sits on the editorial board of Learning and Instruction, Social Psychology of Education and Educational Psychology, and is editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Educational Psychology. I can also tell you from knowing Dave a little that he has absolutely fantastic fieldwork projects in the United Kingdom with incredible data sets on academic emotion, learning, test anxiety, longitudinal data with children and young people, and that also Dave is really profound in terms of publishing academic research, really influential in the field of education and psychology, and was very instrumental as well in helping to establish a psychology of education special group of the British Psychological Society, which I'm hoping that many of us might attend this September. So I'm really excited to have you with us, Dave. Thank you so much for coming to give the seminar today, and we'll really look forward to hearing your words of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you for that kind introduction. So hello to those of you who come here face to face. Hello to those of you who are attending online. So what I'm going to do is get stuck straight in. So the topic of the talk is young people and test anxiety. And the first thing I thought I'd do is share with you a couple of findings from the Healthy School Survey, and I'll read them out because it's quite small. So these are just some little nuggets from the Healthy School Survey, which covers an awful lot of things. But the question was about factors that young people said had a negative impact on their mental health. Okay, so number one, schoolwork. Number one, schoolwork. Number two, with an average of 58.2%, exam. But that wasn't even throughout the various different age groups. The education system in the United Kingdom.
I'm just trying to turn the sound off on this.
Students they're trying to trip me up at the very beginning, aren't they? I've only got like 2 minutes in and they're trying to force me. Students take school leaving exams at the age of 16, and then if they want to progress to upper secondary education, then they take, for want of a better word, upper secondary exit exams at the age of 18, right? So 62.6% of 14 to 16-year-olds said exams had a negative impact on their mental health, 61.7% of 16-plus-year-olds. So the students are progressing through these high-stakes exams. The proportion of students saying it has a negative impact on their mental health increases. Okay. Exams seen as more important than family, bullying, discrimination, social media, and friendships. That's where it sits in the minds of children. Okay, I'll read this out to you again because it's very small. This is just the second selection from the Healthy School Survey. And the question was, topics that you think your teachers should address / discuss with you to support your mental health. Okay, and if I asked you to kind of pick the top 5 topics, you could probably guess them all within a fair degree of accuracy. They are depression and anxiety, number 1. Body image, number 2. Identity, number 3. Self-harm, number 4. Eating disorders, number 5. Okay, so these are all pretty serious things that we're talking about. What comes next? Guess? Exams. And again, there's a breakdown. You know, the older students get a stage of education where they are doing their, important exams, then this number increases. Okay. So, in the minds of the students, a good chunk are saying exams have a negative impact on their mental health, and a good chunk saying that in terms of the topics they want their teachers to talk to them about, you've got the serious mental health stuff, then you've got exams. And exams came out more important than planning for the future, sexual relationships, risk-taking, puberty, peer pressure, peer relationships, bereavement, social media, and resilience. Okay, so what is exam anxiety? Well, exam anxiety has got this element of it which is kind of common to panic. Your heart is beating fast, your legs are going a little bit jellified, maybe your stomach's turning a bit, your hands are a bit clammy, and so on and so on. But what's interesting is it's got this additional component to it, this cognitive component, which is a fear about failure and the consequences of failure that's really quite profound. And associated with this fear of failure and its consequences is this experience that students have, and I'll bring a few quotations up in a minute from students themselves, this experience of freezing up and of going blank, perhaps not entirely dissimilar to what you might call stage fright. So this is a fairly common definition of exam or test anxiety. 3 important things to bear in mind in relation to this. It tends to be enduring. We're not talking about these isolated periods of exam anxiety. You know, most people get anxious at some point about something. This is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is students who consistently tend to get anxious in not all, certainly most of their exams and other performance evaluative situations. So it's enduring, but that doesn't mean it's irreversible. One of the things I'm going to come on to at the end of this talk, which I think is a positive note to finish it off, is that it's incredibly malleable, actually, to short-term intervention. Okay, so point number 2 is that we're not talking about generalized anxiety. We're talking about people who just tend to get anxious in performance evaluative situations where they are going to be judged somehow, or their performance is going to be judged somehow. So that distinguishes it from, folk who tend to get anxious, right across the board. And the third point, I've got to say, I think this is so obvious, it's not worth saying, but it seemed really obvious to me, but it didn't seem obvious to some of the funding bodies I was going to. And I just remember one of them, if you've been around the academic game long enough, you've got you're anything like me, you've got a string of rejections as long as you can see the funding applications. One of the funding applications, sometimes they give you like little bits of feedback with it. One of the funding application came back with a great big reject stamp on it, and the quote was, or the feedback was, "Aren't exams supposed to be stressful?" I don't know. They might be supposed to be stressful, they might not supposed to be stressful, but they are missing the point, I think, that how students respond to them differs widely. Some students will never get anxious. Some students get a bit anxious, some get a bit more, and some get a lot anxious all the time. So this is the important point to make about individual differences. There are wide reactions to the pressures of taking exams. So when we're talking about a response to a threatening situation, what is the threat that we're talking about? It's obviously not a physical threat, it is a psychological threat. And what is the psychological threat? Well, it could be to one's aspirations, it could be to one's sense of identity, it could be fear of being judged negatively by one's peers. If you ask 10 students, you might get 10 different reasons, but they're all various forms of psychological threat. But the important point to bear in mind is that these are subjective, and what is going to be a threat for one student is not going to be a threat for another student, and that includes judgments about what counts as failure. And this is just a quotation from the students to try and illustrate the point. So Year 10 is the penultimate year of secondary education in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. In my last history one, so they're talking about the mock exam there, in my last history one in the year 10 exams, I screwed up in that one completely. Now, I don't know what screwing up completely means to you, right? I know this sounds stupid and people say that I'm being ungrateful, but I got a grade B, okay? And in the assessment regime at the time, A star was the top grade, A was the next grade, B was the next grade. Okay? And there's lots of grades underneath the B as well. She was doing, it was a female student, she was doing pretty well. But I got a B for it in the end because I messed up so much. It's horrible. So, okay, a B for this student was, maybe I'm putting some words in her mouth, was catastrophic. You know, she's saying the worst of it. Whereas for other people, B would be a fantastic result, you know, not a failure at all. So these things are subjective. So when we're talking about the signs of anxiety, as I've already mentioned, it's got elements to it of physiological and emotional arousal, which are common to all forms of anxiety. And then it's got these cognitive components. And really, it's the cognitive components that end up having negative impact on achievement. See shortly. Now, a question I kept getting asked, mostly by those of a practical orientation, people in schools, people who work with schools, so on and so on, is actually how many people are we talking about? You know, are we talking about a relatively small number of people? I'm not sure that makes it any less serious, or are we talking about a huge number of people? I think this is probably a money question rather than a how important question. These are data from about 6,500 English secondary school students that were collected before COVID. And I think you can see two trends here. So these are the proportion of students meeting the 80th scale percentile, okay? This is an arbitrary definition of high test anxiety, and you could arguably say it was set pretty high as well. So these are students who are telling you they get anxious to a high degree all of the time, and you can see the proportion of students increases as they get closer to 18. So this 14 to 16 bracket is when they're taking secondary school leaving qualifications, and the 16 to 18 brackets when they're taking upper secondary exit exams. So the proportion of students experiencing high levels of test anxiety is increasing as we get closer to these exams, and there is a massive disparity between male and female students. Many more female students reporting high levels of test anxiety. So why is it important, actually? Maybe this is an important question to answer. Three potential reasons. Maybe you can argue it's important just in its own right, but three important reasons. First of all, high levels of test anxiety are damaging to achievement. Hence, high anxious students tend to underperform relative to their low anxious counterparts of the same level of ability. Secondly, there are an increasing number of studies which are showing a link from high levels of test anxiety to low well-being in its kind of most generic form. And we'll come onto this in a minute. And thirdly, that high levels of exam anxiety can act as a trigger for potentially more serious forms of anxiety, clinical anxiety disorders, that is. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I'm not sure all of these different cognitive skills are required in all exams. I don't know, maybe speed for time exams, certainly memory for most exams, and then I don't know, maybe some other exams require more flexibility and creativity, so on and so on. But all of these cognitive abilities are negatively impacted by test anxiety. It inhibits creativity, it inhibits flexibility, it slows down speed of processing, so people work more slowly when they're anxious. It inhibits recall from memory, and it can make it difficult to focus and keep attention on tasks. It tends to promote distraction. And perhaps the way in which this manifests most prominently during an actual exam is this experience of freezing up or going blank. So I'll just let you read through these quotations. Please do.
anxiety, are you talking about the anxiety just within the exam, or does it also include like anxiety while you're revising for exams?
Build up to, during, and after. Yeah. I mean, these quotations here are just about the immediate exam experience. But you know what they're getting at is that these students are articulating it's not a lack of effort on their part. They're spending the effort learning, they're spending the effort revising, they get in the exam and it's gone. They get out of the exam, comes back. And actually quite a lot will tell you somewhere in between. Actually, if they can calm themselves down, then they can get back on track during the exam. But obviously they've lost a head start, and when you've got a timed exam, that's problematic. So perhaps then, it's no surprise that you find that highly test anxious students perform worse. So these are data from about 600 schools from 3 schools in Manchester. The first thing you might observe there is that there's a huge amount of messy data going on, but when you plot a regression line through that, the chances of gaining a pass grade in GCSE English, Science and Maths for anything above moderate anxiety was pretty slim. And in fact, actually, the difference between highest grade and lowest grade, the difference between highest anxiety and lowest anxiety amounted to 2 GCSE grades in each of these subjects. So that was quite a lot. That's a percentage between passing English, Science and Maths subjects, or a fail. The difference between a B and a D. This is just a one-off study that I conducted, 15 years ago or so, but it's not a one-off. I mean, there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies of this type, looking at all different measures of achievement at all different ages, and they all come to pretty much the same conclusion. And of course, those of you who are statistically minded will obviously know that this is just correlational data, and that ends up begging a kind of chicken and egg question. Actually, is it the test anxiety that is driving the lower achievements in the manner that the students of quotations have described, or is it actually possibly the reverse, that you've got low achieving students to begin with and just get more anxious about exams? How do you unpick the chicken and egg? Well, if you're working with naturalistic data, and I work with naturalistic data, then what you need to do is statistically control for students' prior ability or their prior achievement. And there's not a huge number of studies that have done this, but here's just one example. And this took year 6 school children. So these children were in their final year of primary school, and they were waiting to sit their national curriculum test exams at the end of year 6. And they or rather they were given what we call Raven's regressive matrices, which are a way of establishing people's non-verbal cognitive ability. So they're kind of nice in the sense that they're not related to any particular reading ability or sort of cultural knowledge and so on and so on. I'm sure you've seen these kinds of things, but what you basically get is a series of geometric patterns with one missing, and you've got to choose which one out of these kind of options here fits the missing one. And they start off really, really easy. And then by the time you get to the end, I'm not sure anyone could do them actually. So, they're really good at establishing cognitive ability. So anyway, when you account for children's prior cognitive ability, the relation, which in this case was on these year 6 national curriculum tests, remains. So even when you kind of account for that prior cognitive ability, you still find it's test anxiety that is driving the lower achievement. And there's a handful of studies of this type at different ages and so on and so on. Okay. Can I just have a quick show of hands? Not online, but in the people in the room. Who's from a psychology background here? Okay, there's a fair few people. For those of you who are from a psychology background, have you ever heard of something called the Yerkes-Dodson law? So you read that? Yeah, the Yerkes-Dodson law. Okay, I'm really glad nobody has, because it means you've not been fed a load of rubbish. But it is an apparent relationship between stress and performance that looks like an inverted U. So it goes like that. Well, it looks like a normal distribution curve, actually. And if you imagine that you've got stress on the x-axis and you've got performance on the y-axis, what it apparently shows is that as stress increases, performance increases, and your best performance is going to be at a moderate level of stress, and then at extreme levels of stress, your performance dips off, and therefore leads to the conclusion that a bit of stress isn't a bad thing. Sounds extremely plausible. I'm not going to get on my hobby horse about this because I could go on for a long time, but needless to say, it's got nothing to do with Yerkes or Dodson. It's complete nonsense. There's no evidence for it. Anyway, I could go into a lot of detail, but I won't. But I came across these recently, and I think it really nicely illustrates the point. So these are from PISA 2015. And on the x-axis, we've got test anxiety, and on the y-axis, we've got reading scores on the panel to the left, we've got math test scores in the middle, and we've got science test scores to the right. And this is the curvy linear relationship between anxiety and performance. And what it shows is a small, titchy degree of test anxiety has a very, very small facilitative effect. And after that, sorry folks, it's all downhill. And that's on nearly 390,000 students. I don't know if that, large numbers convince people sometimes. It's done on a lot of people, that must be real, right? Yeah. So, test anxiety is debilitating in anything more than the titchiest amounts. And that is why. Because stress is not a uniform thing. People can react to stress with a challenge response. And in fact, when you have a challenge response, your performance increases and then levels off. Or you can have a threat response, which is what test anxiety is. And as test anxiety increases, your performance decreases. Okay. I hope I've all convinced you. Test anxiety is bad for achievement. I'll just say a little bit about well-being and mental health. For those of you who know anything about well-being, it's kind of one of the most kind of amorphous and ill-defined constructs there is out there. So let's just say I'm using it in a relatively broad fashion here to capture subjective well-being. The balance of positives and negatives in one's life. I'm not using it to refer to mental health here. I think we should keep well-being and mental health defined and operationalised. Okay, so these are data from just over 1,000 students from years 10 and 11, and they were put into a latent profile analysis, which is a statistical way of working out which kind of groups cluster together on particular dimensions. And the dimensions we've got here are test anxiety, school-related well-being, so the balance, how students were feeling about their school life, positives and negatives, and then 2 mental health disorders, symptoms of mental health disorders, symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder and symptoms of panic disorder. Okay, the largest group here, 38.9%, I've labelled low risk. Why have I labelled these people low risk? Because they had low scores on test anxiety, they had low scores on symptoms of generalized anxiety and panic, and they had above average well-being. Okay, and it's kind of reassuring in one way that this is the largest group. And we've got a group, 21.5%, who've basically got mean scores on all of these things. Okay, so these students seem to be coping okay. Then we've got another fairly substantial group, 31.7%, who've got elevated, above average test anxiety, above average generalized anxiety, above average panic, and below average well-being. I've labelled these potential risks. And then the smallest group, Fortunately, only 7.9%. These are the ones with really high test anxiety and accompanied with symptoms of generalized anxiety and panic disorder, and also much lower than the. So it strikes me, if you're somebody who's interested in intervention and support, it strikes me that this is kind of working towards what you might call tiered support for students. You've got a group who is most in need and they need a slightly more intensive intervention, potentially slightly longer, and you've got another group who are at a lower risk. They still need intervention, but it can be less intensive, maybe it can be a little bit more brief. The other thing that speaks to me from this, and I don't know if you've drawn this conclusion from looking at this graph, is that test anxiety seems to be going hand in hand, correlating with symptoms of generalized anxiety and symptoms of panic disorder. As test anxiety is going up, so are these. As test anxiety is going lower, so are these. And again, you end up in a kind of chicken and egg situation. Is it the test anxiety that's driving the generalized anxiety and panic, or is it the other way around? Or some combination of the two? So in order to answer this question, you need to conduct a study where you've got at least 2 waves of data collection. So this is from about 1200 12 participants, and we've got exam anxiety and risk for ED measured at 2 separate time points. Risk for ED, risk for emotional developing an emotional disorder. Emotion disorders covers depression, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, social anxiety, something else. I can't remember. All types of anxiety disorders and depression. Okay. Test anxiety and risk for emotion disorder were positively correlated at the first wave of data collection, positively correlated at the second wave of data collection. Okay, that's what we know already. We also, if we add on paths, these are, for those of you who are statistically minded, these are regression paths. When we add on regression paths from time 1 to time 2, we can see that test anxiety is stable. So for those of you who are statistically minded, regression coefficient of 0.68, standardized regression coefficient is really strong. So test anxiety was staying pretty stable from time 1 to time 2. The risk of emotion disorder, however, was much, much, much less stable. That was much more variable over that time point, as you would anticipate. But this is the interesting bit now. Is exam anxiety at time 1 driving risk for emotion disorder at time 2, even when we account for them being concurrently correlated at time 1 and time 2, and also stable from time 1 to time 2 in case of exam anxiety? And the answer is yes. Students who were more anxious at the first wave of data collection showed a greater risk for emotion disorder at the second wave of data collection, and vice versa, actually. But when you look at the relative strength of these 2 paths, the risk of test anxiety resulting in increased emotion disorder is much stronger than risk of emotion disorder for students becoming more subsequently test anxious. So it does work bidirectionally, but it's much stronger from test anxiety to subsequent risk for emotion disorder.
Can I just ask,
Yeah, please do.
does that mean people who were anxious, like in September at the start of term, was that the first testing period, and then 7 months later it was actually as exams came close? Were people anxious in the forward, you know?
Yeah, the first wave of data collection was kind of mid-October for this study, so it wasn't right at the beginning of the year, but it was fairly close to the beginning of the year. And yeah, 7 months later, it was kind of like March time. April time, as we were getting closer to exams. Yeah.
Sorry for somebody who's anxious that early on.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's awful. I mean, I did quite a lot of screening for intervention with some of the local secondary schools around Liverpool, and I mean, especially post-COVID, I mean, 35% of the cohort reporting clinical levels of anxiety. I mean, 30%, a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
What's going on? Really, what's going on? It's all
Had harder lockdowns here than you guys had. So yeah, we really did. Yeah.
it really makes you feel.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you probably agree with me. you know, one suicide is one suicide too many. I thought this was just a really interesting study. It wasn't specifically to do with test anxiety, but it speaks to the issue of test anxiety. And it was an analysis of coroner's reports over a 16-month period of those folk under 20 years old. There were 130 adolescent suicides recorded in England over this 16-month period. Academic pressures started in 27% of them. Exam pressures specifically, 20% of them. You know, maybe this is a very extreme end of things. What it doesn't tell you is attempted suicides, though, and you know, you can see from this bottom study here, in those that had attempted suicide, academic pressures were the strongest reason. Okay. Another important question, I think, that needs answering is where test anxiety comes from. There's various different models. This is my favourite model, but just bear in mind it's not the only model, it's just my favourite model. And I mean, I'm going to run through it. It's quite a complex model, but I'm just going to run through it very briefly. It's got three key bits to it. The first bit is the beliefs people hold about themselves. The second bit is the beliefs about the importance of an exam. And the third element is people's behaviours and achievement settings. So we'll start off with the first one. Beliefs about oneself, beliefs about others, beliefs about the future. And what test anxious persons tend to hold are, for want of a better word, negative beliefs. Negative beliefs about themselves in relation to achievement. For instance, these are fairly common in test anxious persons. Unless I achieve at whatever I do, I'm worthless. So the person has, you know, linked their identity and esteem to their academic achievement so strongly and so intimately. Any threat to their achievement then becomes a threat to their sense of self-worth. Negative judgments about others. My family will judge me negatively because I'm less competent than others. Negative beliefs about the future. That continuing education, continued exams will just continue to pose a threat. This is not something that's just now. So you've got these personal beliefs, and then these feed into what's called executive processing. And executive processing is a horribly complicated sounding word, and all executive means to a psychologist is conscious stuff rather than the stuff that's bubbling away under the surface, and stuff that you can willfully control. You know, when I say think of the pink elephant out there, you know, you can make yourself, no, I'm going to really focus on his concentration now instead of the pink elephant out of the room. You know, to some degree, we control and shift our attention and what we think about. So anyway, when the person is posed with a trigger, and that trigger might be, for instance, that teacher saying to them, right, your exams are 3 months away, and they write a little number of days on the board, which, you know, some teachers like doing. That's the number of days you've got left to revise, and the students, you know, kind of processing this, and some of the questions that are going to be coming up to themselves, either consciously or just above that level of conscious thought, is, am I going to pass? Is this important to me? Which subject do I need to revise first? When am I going to start revising? Oh my God, I haven't done enough revision yet, and all of this stuff starts bubbling up. And then when you've got that top-down input of, actually, if I fail all of this, I'm a total failure. What's the easiest thing to do if you don't like flying? Don't get on a plane. What's the easiest thing to do if you don't like exams, or if exams pose this level of psychological threat to you? Speak to the hand. You know, you put psychological distance between you and the thing that's threatening you. You know, maybe students in compulsory education can't do the equivalent of not getting on the plane, but what they can do is put psychological distance. Excuse me. And we'll come on to that in the next slide. But how do these negative personal beliefs about oneself, other people, and the future interact with these negative processes? Well, these are really, really common, what you might call ways of exaggerating threat, of exaggerating negative consequences. Clinical psychologists call these hot thoughts. They heat up the anxiety. For instance, overgeneralization. I failed my English exam, so I'm going to fail all of them. Fortune telling. I know I'm going to fail even if I try. Mind reading. My parents all think I'm a failure. Selective abstraction. If only on one question on the exam, I'm going to fail them all. All or nothing thinking. If I don't get the highest grade, I've failed. Catastrophizing. If I fail the exams, my whole life is a failure. What are these things doing? They're just putting more pressure on yourself. Okay, so how does the person behave in achievement settings? Well, because of all of this exaggerated threat, they become what's called vigilant or hypervigilant for these threats. So they're constantly on the lookout for cues. Most students who are highly test anxious, not all, I might say, but most attempt to put some psychological distance between themselves and the thing that's threatening them. And the most common way of doing that is procrastinating, starting revision, self-sabotage, putting obstacles in the way of your success, or what's called, strategic withdrawal of effort. If I don't try and I fail, it's much less of a threat to my esteem because I didn't try. You've got a ready-made reason for failure. And the outcome of all of this, anxiety, cognitive interference, distress, and ultimately lower achievement. And what happens the next time this is triggered? The next time you get back in the class and the student says, you've now got one day less. The number goes down, the whole thing just goes over again. But it needn't be just the teacher telling you, it can be your own thoughts. Remember, I need to start revision and then it's continue. So this is what you might call a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. I hope this isn't too depressing, so. Because we're on to the last bit now. What can be done about it? Okay. There's a handful, not a huge number, a handful of meta-analyses showing that things can be done about it, actually. And I suppose, like with any psychological intervention, we've got everything from the kind of traditional cognitive behavioural intervention at one end to the weird and wonderful over at the other end. Stroking pets, colouring things in, writing down your negative thoughts, running around, etc., etc. Maybe not a surprise, the stuff that's at the kind of more creative end, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but maybe this is no great surprise because CBI was invented for depression and anxiety. The most consistent, effective intervention for test anxiety is cognitive behavioural intervention. And what can you do in cognitive behavioural intervention? Well, it works on this idea that thoughts, emotions, physiology, and behaviour are all reciprocally related to one another. And if you change any one of them, it will have a knock-on impact on the others. So if you can change the way people are thinking about these exams, I target the thought component, that will positively impact their emotion, behaviour, and physiology. If you teach students effective ways of revising, and if anybody wants to know, I'll unpack it a little bit in a minute what I mean by effective. If you change people's behaviour, so rather than avoiding, they're actually using their revision in a way that can help combat their negative thoughts, that will have positive impact on their emotions and physiology. Or you can just teach people to control their physiological and emotional reactions to anxious situations with visualization, with progressive muscle relaxation, with diaphragmatic breathing, which, all of these things are incredibly easy to learn. That will have a positive impact on their behaviour and physiology. So if you target all of these different things, then what you're doing is breaking up the vicious cycle, turning it into a virtuous cycle. So, I'm just going to briefly touch on these because this is a presentation in its own right. What does cognitive intervention involve? This is probably the most involved and difficult element of the cognitive behavioural intervention in my view. It involves teaching students to recognise for themselves what their thoughts are that are heating up the anxiety. So, for instance, if a student is catastrophising, I'll fail these exams, my whole life is a failure. What you need to teach students to do is challenge them effectively. And that might be, for instance, it's no good telling students this isn't going to happen, right? Because it might. And they can always come back. So what you've got to do is respond in a way that is actually meaningful to the student that they can't come back with. And that might be just thinking about alternatives. And it's getting the student to get in a habit of thinking alternatives. So every time that they're thinking that catastrophic thought, they're thinking, no, there are other options for me. And it takes a while to get the hang of, and it takes a while to be able to get proficient at it, but it's the most effective long-term solution. Physiological interventions, I don't know. Can I have a quick show of hands? Who's ever been to a yoga class? Okay, there's a fair chunk of you. Some of you might have done something similar in a yoga class, depending upon how authentic they were. Because I know some of the really authentic yoga teachers don't like dabbling in this kind of stuff. But progressive muscle relaxation is where you start with one part of your body, like your fist, and you clench up really tight, and you hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you go on to your fists and your shoulders, and then you hunch them up and you get them really tight, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you actually work through your whole body, and you just get people doing this, and they're learning to identify when they're feeling scrunched up, and then just how to let go, how to let your muscles drop. Diaphragmatic breathing. So when you're anxious, you breathe from the chest. Diaphragmatic breathing, or if you want to just be not so kind of complex about it, for deep breathing, is when you breathe from your diaphragm. There's 101,000 instructional videos on YouTube how to do this. You know, breathing through your nose slowly and counting to 4, and then imagining your breath comes all the way down to your diaphragm. You can actually put your hand on your diaphragm if you want to feel it expand, and holding it there for 4, and then breathing out through your mouth in a controlled fashion for 4. I mean, it's about as simple as you get, and it works really quickly and really effectively. And it does 2 things. It takes your attention away from the thing which is causing you anxiety onto something which you can control, and you can control your breathing. So it immediately kind of takes your attention away from the worrisome thing. That's one thing. Simultaneously, it's actually reducing your ANS arousal. That is the biggest, quickest, easiest win with students. They love it. Why do they love it? Because it's really quick and easy to learn, and it's really quick and easy to work. Okay, how do you overcome behavioural avoidance? You get students planning their revision. You know, one thing that really strikes me, I don't know about Irish students, Republic of Irish students, English students, they're really good at planning revision, and they make these really colourful charts. And you know, that's probably the most impressive thing about it, actually. And then they're very good at doing their revision. But if you say to them, was your revision effective? It's like, I don't know. How do you test if your revision is effective? Test yourself. So what you've got to get students to start doing is setting specific goals. And those goals have got to be tangible, they've got to be SMART goals. You all know what SMART goals are. They've got to be tangible, they've got to be achievable, they've got to be relatively short. Then they do the revision, then they test themselves, then they ask themselves, have I met that goal? And if they have met their goal, great, they can move on to another goal. If they haven't, why? Do they need to revise again? Were they distracted? Was the type of revision they were using ineffective? They also only know about 3 ways of revising. You've got to teach students different ways of revising as well, so that they've got an alternative to move to. You know, the version they're using is ineffective. But by getting them to pose that question, goal, learn, test, revisit goal, you're getting them in a habit of giving themselves constant feedback. And in some ways, although it's, you know, you've got to help students through this process. When students start giving themselves feedback, they're putting themselves in control, and what undermines anxiety is control. So they know what they know. It's not an unknown. So if they get good at this, then that's going to help kind of combat their negative beliefs. And if they're not good at it, it will give them a mode of getting good with it. Quite often they need a lot of support with this. You can't just say to students, go and do this. You know, they need to be led through it. But it's giving them a method, it's giving them a tool of working. Okay, I use an intervention called STEPS, which comprises all of these components. It's a 6-week session. Each session lasts about 45 minutes. Here's an outcome study. Early intervention, late intervention means certain things to certain people. You were intervening late, you were intervening early. It doesn't mean that in this context here. What I mean in this context here is early intervention were the intervention group and the late intervention were the waitlist group. So early intervention group had the intervention for 6 weeks, then a week break, and the late intervention had the intervention for 6 weeks. What does it show? Well, the group who got their intervention first showed a nearly large. For those of you who are statistically minded, a D of 0.76 is pretty good. It's a moderate to large reduction in test anxiety, and the late intervention group, when they got their intervention, showed a commensurate reduction in test anxiety. Just in 6 weeks, 45 sessions a week. Great. Okay, not quite as sophisticated a design because we couldn't capture data from the control group here. But yeah, we've got, in this case, a large reduction in test anxiety after intervention compared to the control group. Same intervention, generalized anxiety scores. Same intervention, panic disorder scores. So intervening with test anxiety does not just lower test anxiety scores, it also lowers scores for generalized anxiety and panic disorder too. This is an evaluation of the intervention used by the CAMS service in West London NHS Trust. What we have got here is 82% of students saying they found it helpful or very helpful. 6% said they didn't find it helpful. I can live with those odds. If you give this intervention to 100 kids and you help 82 of them, I can live with that. And I'll leave you with that quote. I'll be very, very happy. Make any questions?
Thank you, Dave. That was fascinating. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you to our audience for thinking of some wonderful questions to ask Dave. We also have an online audience, and I just want to say a special hello to our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have academics, we have practitioners, we have educators in our online audience as well. So please do feel free to put your hands up. Dave, do you want to just take questions? And I'll offer up some online questions for you as well.
Okay, so we've got 1, 2, so we'll start here, please.
Yeah, so that was my main question kind of comes, I suppose, so I'm from the United States, so we don't have this system of what I would call kind of all or can't repeat your A levels for a full year.
You can take a 3rd year of A-level.
Yeah, so you can take another year.
Yeah.
So for example, for my college test, I took it 3 times and I finished back before. Oh, no. So I wonder, have you looked at test anxiety when the stakes are changed? You know, when there actually is that opportunity to just do it again. When, you know, that kind of all or nothing, because when I was looking at the cognitive behavioral therapy, there's these questions that children will ask themselves, like, what if I fail? So I do think the system kind of sets people up in a way that, yeah, if you fail, it's not very kind to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We used to have a system in the UK, not for A-level, but for GCSE, so the exams that have been studied from 14 to 16, up until about 20, it ran from about 2005, no, from about 2000 to about 2015, where students could take certain subjects, not all subjects, like science and maths, in a series of small modules over the course of 2 years, rather than one big terminal exam. And they could also repeat those over a period of time. Rather conservative, leaning conservative government, if that wasn't so like tautology, got rid of them because they felt schools were gaming the system, like allowing their students to resit. Anyway, so we used to have this system in the UK. Did students report high levels of test anxiety? Yes. As much as you can make a comparison from then to now on different groups of people, has test anxiety increased? Yes. Do folks still get anxious in the States on Common Core Standard tests? Have I got the double terminology right?
Yeah.
Yes. Do a lot get test anxious? Yes. So I mean, if you go back to the UK, back, you know, to sort of like 2000 to 2015, we were finding approximately 16%, about 20% females, 10% males, and now it's maybe up to about 25%. So yeah, I broadly agree with you. The system, the way a system is structured, is going to put some people in a position that exaggerates those fears, but it certainly will not stop test anxiety. Thank you. A question at the back?
Two questions or points, one in relation to your previous one. I mean, PISA, the stakes are low, right? In fact, they're zero. And you still get that relationship between, So, I mean, it's really interesting that if you find that effect for PISA, I imagine you get much bigger effects for A levels where stakes are really high. And the other thing is that as a third level educator, I'm wondering, do we have evidence on this for third level for higher education?
You know, you'd be surprised actually that there's been very, very little work done on test anxiety and university students. There is a guy at the University of Liverpool who's doing some work on it. I don't think he's got as far as trying out intervention, but there's no reason why this intervention couldn't just be taken wholesale and used with higher education students. And University of Sunderland in the UK are doing that right now. And I hope they keep their promise and send me a nice report.
It's just not a conversation I can recall us having. I've been working here for 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, informally, people talk about it. It hasn't been looked at systematically.
No, I mean, funnily enough, it's a conversation that, I mean, certainly, I mean, I can't really talk about John Moores, maybe occasional conversations with folk from other institutions. It's arisen in the past few years, but only as part of a just general, what seems like a glut of mental health issues that students are presenting with as undergraduates now, in that they seem very sensitive to academic pressures, or more sensitive to academic pressures than they used to be, and that, you know, manifests in lots of unpleasant ways.
You know what? I don't think anybody has wakes in the middle of the night in a cold sweat thinking about their university exam. It's the least stress exams people still have. I think that just feels like a big all or nothing to students. I think more than college tests do. It's, anecdotally. Yeah.
Before we take this question, can I just check how many we've got online?
We have questions from the online audience if you'd like to answer it.
Just one. Okay, well, can we take that one first, then come to yours?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Niall asks, thank you, Niall, for your question. Niall says, exams seem to map on poorly to the real world as they rarely reflect common challenges we encounter within our professional or personal lives. Is at least part of the explanation for the phenomenon of test anxiety actually the alien nature of the task? And if so, is an argument for the reduction of the conventional exam as a form of evaluation?
I mean, that's a slightly different question to the issue of test anxiety. I mean, what I'd say is that if students have been in school since the age of 5, it shouldn't be alien to them. Actually, one of the easiest wins secondary schools can do is just start sticking students in halls and taking exams in rows of desks at the age of 11, and removing the theatre and removing the ritual of taking an exam, so it's just like normalised, so that when they come to take these high stakes ones, that, you know, it's lost this element of weirdness and unknowns to it. But the question, I mean, the real nub of Niall's question about whether exams are relevant to the real world, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry.
Thanks, but you also had a question.
I do have a question actually.
Yes.
I wasn't going to ask. What do you, okay, I'm going to ask my question.
Okay.
So this is the obvious question. Do you think we should be examining students?
Exams are just a tool. If you want to assess students in some way, you're going to get some who are going to get anxious about it. So getting rid of exams is not necessarily the solution. You know, back again in the UK when we used to have coursework, not necessarily, you know, test anxious students would not, highly test anxious students would not necessarily have a preference for doing lots of coursework because they used to get equally het up about that. Maybe it would be better to broaden it out to just assessment anxiety.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was brilliant listening to you. And maybe less questions, more points of observation and conversation later on. And one of them you hinted already, the collapse of graphs at the 18 plus cohort in a way that made me also wonder if eventually, if we would follow these individuals as they progress to tertiary education, and maybe even if they would later on become what we call alternative access route students, there would be differences in the sense that there might be observed turnaround points where these anxieties cease to exist or where stress is reduced. And I'm asking what I'm talking about is particular out of my own experience, or more as an anecdotal thing. I was one of the students who had very bad test anxiety throughout most of my primary and later in high school, and I went on to university, and I did so all right. It didn't. There was something that was inherently alien to testing from that moment forth. And I came back around to university when I was 27 after a life in the and maybe again, like Niall's point hinted, I realized actually all of that testing, it doesn't happen in my day-to-day work. People here, they pay me for the work I do. In a way, they test on my work. They still want to see if I do a good job. But it is very, very complex. Often outputs are less numerically driven. And even if they are, they're hiding behind other metrics. So I went back to university and I did terrific. I just flying colors throughout my whole career so far, and I hope it stays that way. But I realized a lot of it had to do with the fact that I did not attach my self-worth anymore to these type of tests in a way. And so I wondered if we would follow that, these alternative access routes, or would there be an observed turnaround point eventually?
Yeah, oh, what a great story.
Oh, yeah. Brought back a lot of things also on what you said. And actually, last time I felt test anxiety, funny enough, because you mentioned these seating rows, was a formalized exchange of 6 months in Hong Kong, where we all of a sudden had to take tests in these really structured halls with rows and rows of seatings, and I just felt very alienated and thrown back into high school and all the other schoolings. And that was, again, actually, that was one time where it flared up again, and I somehow managed to be, which was good enough for me at that time. But yeah, so.
Yeah. So can people turn it around? Do we need to? Okay. So can people turn it around? Yes, they can. You know, I mean, I've talked about a structured intervention, but people can work through these issues in their own way and in their own time. And as you've demonstrated, they can. You know, people by nature are resilient. Will everyone turn it around? No. I don't know about other education systems, but I think one of the flaws and faults of the education system in England at the moment is that opportunities for what you might call late blossomers, I'm a late blossomer as well, have become harder and harder and harder to find. And we're just not giving people that second chance. And people come to these decisions sometimes not at the same rate at which the school system wants them to. And I really strongly believe that, you know, we should be providing opportunities for folks and adults and so on and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the seminar, so thank you all so very much for your questions, for the discussion. Thank you to our online participants for sticking with us and for your questions. And thank you most of all to you, Professor David Putwain, for a fantastic talk and sharing your insights into your career researching test anxiety. And I think that all of us will have something to think about going home today, using the knowledge that you've shared with us from the seminar. But thanks again.